gimmicky, little gimmicky things you can do with Visual Basic. So, and then kind of as I went and started my undergrad, my dad encouraged me to do something else other than computer science just because I've been doing it. So I did a molecular biology undergrad. And as Jan mentioned, I did an MBA as well, and was an entrepreneur for about 7 years with a software startup in health technology. And then after I sold that, I actually came back to academia, and that's kind of really where my focus has been. And I actually wanted to always be in academia. All my uncles are professors, and the lifestyle was always very intriguing to me. And then the entrepreneurship kind of ventures, the health tech ventures that I pursued, it just seemed like a right time for our company to be able to take advantage of some of the market inefficiencies that we saw in health tech. So my kind of whole spiel and purpose in that spiel is that I've always sort of gravitated towards interesting new technologies that kind of facilitate kind of manual, make things that were traditionally manually done easier to complete. So this is where we land on VosViewer. I actually had never heard of this program before until actually Leyland introduced it to me, who's on the call right now. And just to Jan's point, what I'll be doing today is I'll be introducing VosViewer, kind of talking a little bit about what the purpose of VosViewer is and what are some of the previously manually done bibliometric analyses that it facilitates, and it makes it a lot easier to do. I'll be talking about how that works. This is a pretty interactive demo. If you have any burning questions while I'm going through it or want me to do something again, feel free to stop me, and I'm happy to kind of redo what I've been doing. At the same time, I do have a chunk of time reserved at the end for questions as well. So it's kind of a free-flowing demo. I do have this prepared, but if you really want to see something again, just feel free to stop me. And as well, the purpose of this demo is to kind of encourage you to try and write a paper yourself based on what we learned today. So if you have any questions after, I'll put up my contact information, and anyone here can feel free to email me.
What I forgot to mention really quickly, Andrew, is that Andrew will be graduating in about 12-ish months. And
earliest timeline, but yeah.
About. And you know, when I graduated, I thought I was really lucky to be hired into academia because I wasn't really sure how everything was going to work out. In contrast, I think whoever ends up hiring Andrew will be the lucky ones, because he's a very hardworking, very pleasant person to work with. So I'm just putting the word out there, especially for those who are in hiring positions. You know, this superstar in the making.
Thanks, Jan. Much appreciated. It's kind of you to say. Okay, perfect. So let's get started. So what I was mentioning before we even actually jump into VosViewer, when I started my PhD, I had a course with Leyland, who's on the call. And one of the kind of goals of the course is to get a published paper out. So as PhD students, especially when I started, it seemed like a giant black box to me. I really didn't know where to start in coming up with an idea of, a paper to write. I didn't know what the publication process was. And there's, as we all have learned during our PhDs, as fruitful an endeavor as academia is, there's a lot of kind of street games that are played with the public process, right? So I think from a very pragmatic point of view, the course that Leyland taught us allowed us to not only research something that was interesting to us, but kind of get that kind of first win as a PhD student. So one thing that we did in that first course, this was a couple months after I started my PhD, but we wrote a paper that was a bibliometric review of a technology journal called Research Technology Management. And what we learned in Leyland's course is that a lot of journal editors, they really like seeing these bibliometric reviews and bibliographic analyses for several reasons. First of all, it's nice to see that someone put a lot of time and effort into compiling a study on what the journal's been doing, right? So it's a little bit unusual for somebody to completely unprovoked write a big study on your journal if you're a journal editor, right? So I think that's that catches their attention as well. But on top of a lot of kind of practical things that come out of a bibliometric view, both from the author's standpoint and the journal editor's standpoint. So from an author's standpoint, if I'm a prospective author for a particular journal, it's interesting for me to know what the trends in that journal have been. So in this particular journal, we find that a lot of the published papers have been shifting towards new product development and information technologies, whereas about 15 years ago, this research technology management journal, they were focused on kind of biotechnology and manufacturing. So if I'm a prospective author and I'm ahead of the curve and I'm already writing about new product development and information technology, this might be a good journal for me to target. And conversely, from the journal editor's standpoint, bibliometric reviews are quite interesting because it not only gives a lay of the land of the different publications that are coming in, or submissions that are coming in, and what's being accepted, but there's a lot of nuance that gets unfurled when you actually start looking at data of journals. So one thing that, one other study that Leyland and I did, we found that there were a lot of papers coming from Southeast Asia for a particular journal, and journal editors, they really liked these papers and were being published. But it turns out a lot of these papers that were being published from Southeast Asia and that the Asia Pacific region, they weren't that influential. They weren't getting that many citations. So then it allows the journal editors to take a step back and assess what their priorities are. Do they want a lot of topics, or do they want a lot of papers in a certain topic, or are they trying to up their impact factor through whatever means necessary? And whether it doesn't really matter which avenue is appropriate for them, just being able to actually take a data-driven look at what the journal should be publishing and what their goals are quite interesting to these journal editors. So going back to research technology management, it was successfully published. It was a huge win for both me and Vanessa, who were both PhD students. We started at the same time. At the same time, the data collection and the writing process was extremely cumbersome, and it consumed our lives for about 4 months. So just to give a quick example, you see this table here on my screen that'll make a little bit bigger. Just a simple table like this. If we take a look at the citation counts of papers that were published in these years, so from 1998 to 2000, we see there are 155 papers, and this is the breakdown of how many citations they all got. All of this data we crunched manually. So we went to some citation indexing service like Scopus or Web of Science. We dumped all of that into a Google sheet that we worked on. And you can imagine that just this table probably took us about 4 weeks or so to compile. And then when you actually go into a table like this and you start looking at individual papers, we start looking at the topic, compiling all this information like the total citation count and how many years it's been around. This is a really laborious and manual process. And to spend 6 months writing a bibliometric review like this, it's kind of untenable for a really prolific academic who wants to get out 3 or 4 papers a year and teach on top of that. So we kind of knew that if we wanted to kind of pursue some more of these bibliometric analyses, there has to be a better way, right? And on top of that, just my last point on this particular paper, the information is interesting. So we see things like, the most prolific author is from McMaster, and he's got 16 articles in this particular journal. It's interesting information, but it's not really necessarily profound, or there's really not much sophistication here. It's a lot of very basic quantitative collation. And if you want to actually look at, what the networks of different authors are, and what universities are publishing more, what universities are co-authoring with authors from other universities, it's infeasible to be able to create all that information manually, right? So there's a limit to what you can do manually. So that's when Leyland actually picked up the phone and called me one day. He introduced me to this tool called VosViewer that, in theory, when I first went through their website, it kind of maddened me in that, because I didn't know what this tool was, if I had known that it existed, a lot of this information would have been trivial to compile, right? So all of this information, like who the top authors are, what country they're coming from, and how many articles they've published, rather than us having to go through each paper and tabulate that manually, it's theory, this to pump that information out within minutes, right? So on one hand, I was really excited that this existed, and on the other, I was kind of kicking myself for not having done the research before, knowing that this tool exists. So what I'll show you here is a quick sample of the type of information that you can get out of VosViewer. And then we'll actually dig in and start to use it. So this is another kind of paper that we'll dig into that was just recently published that Leyland was also a part of. But similarly, you can kind of see that this is a paper that we produced with data that was actually outputted by VosViewer. But very similarly, we see papers on these particular topics. This is all generated automatically through VosViewer, whereas through that other paper, we would have had to spend weeks manually tabulating this. But what's really cool is you get much deeper insights into what's happening in a field of study or in a particular journal. This is actually a paper that we wrote on what the current state of literature is on fake news and deep fakes. You've probably seen kind of on Twitter and media a lot of these completely artificially generated speeches from Donald Trump that he's never said these things, but people have some fun with it and they make these deep fakes and they make a ridiculous fake speech by Donald Trump talking about hamburgers and stuff like that. But what VosViewer is able to generate are kind of these network maps where in a particular body of literature, say, I'll just throw some random numbers here, but we see 1,000 papers talking about fake news. And these papers reference other papers that talk about social media. And social media is also tangentially related to papers that talk about Trump and politics, right? If we look here. So VosViewer is able to generate these network maps for you automatically. And then the onus is on you to interpret them and talk about them. But it makes for a much richer paper. And if journal editors like these manually driven reviews, as they are, having some deeper insights like this, in theory, would get journal editors even more interested in your manuscript. So it turns out that going through VosViewer, I mean, this isn't what kind of focus magic here. There's a lot of science behind this particular program, but it's very easy to use. And since Leyland and I discovered VosViewer, I think we've written 7 or 8 manuscripts and gotten acceptances for 4 or 5 of them already. So it's been a very productive endeavor going into this. And in this workshop, I'd like to walk you through how to use VosViewer and kind of get you started on writing your own paper using this tool.
Andrew?
Yeah.
When you think about the time that went into the first paper where you did everything manually compared to using VosViewer, do you reckon you could have written 6 or 7 papers in the time it took you to write that first one?
So if from a purely data-driven standpoint, I would say probably pretty close, but at that time I didn't necessarily really understand the writing, like academic writing styles, and I'm still learning right now, but I think I've gotten much more efficient at writing over the past 4 years, or 3 or 4 years. So no, I don't think I could have pumped out 6 or 7 at that time, but the rate limiting factor there is kind of my inability to pump out academic papers rather than the data part. So
right.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, good question. So what I'll do now is I'll actually take us through kind of how VosViewer works. So this particular thing I showed you here, I was a little skeptical when I was so VosViewer, they don't actually do a great job of advertising how cool their tool is. And the tool was written by academics in Belgium, so that might be understandable. But when you take a look at some of the screenshots that they offer on their website, it looks a little bit it looks a little bit dense and you can't really make sense of it. But what I did want to show you is actually how VosViewer works to try and hopefully convince you that there's a lot of good math and logic that's behind this particular software tool, and it's not just kind of random bubbles that you see on the screen. So what VosViewer does is it first takes a raw data source, and a raw data source you can output from a lot of these indexing services. So the example that we'll use for this particular workshop is we'll kind of reverse engineer this fake newspaper that we did. But let's say I wanted to look at the state of the art of fake news papers, and I wanted to find all the papers, academic papers that are out there in the world that's related to fake news or deep fakes or something like that. what I do is first I create that index through Web of Science. I'd get a full list of those papers, and then I'd feed it into VosViewer, and then VosViewer actually uses that as the raw data. And I'm going to show us actually how we do that. But first, I want to show you how VosViewer actually works theoretically, just so you have a somewhat of an understanding of what VosViewer is doing behind the scenes. So, for example, this is an output that you can get from VosViewer, and these are different authors that have published papers related to fake news. And this is how they are linked to each other. So I'm just going to quickly make these labels a little bit bigger and these bubbles a bit bigger. So before we dive into how this works, this is, like I said, a sample of authors who have written papers on fake news. And we see that Alcott here is kind of a central author because Alcott has published a paper with Pennycook on this side. Alcott has published a paper with Tandock. Alcott has published a paper with Nelson, and so on. So how does VosViewer determine the length of these connections between the two? What are these bubbles? Why is this bubble from Alcott bigger than the one from Pennycook? And I'll quickly explain just very briefly how VosViewer calculates these. So the size of the bubble is correlated to how many papers that particular author has written. So Alcott is a very prolific author when it comes to papers related to fake news. Pennycook is as well, since they actually made this network, but they haven't written as many papers as Alcott. And then as far as these kind of connections between these nodes are all the authors. The way that VosViewer calculates them, I'll just use a very simple example here, is like this. So this is kind of, in theory, the mathematical model of how VosViewer works. So these are all individual authors. So let's say we have author 1, author 2, author 3, and so on. Let's say author 1 actually published 2 papers with author 2, A2. And they've only published 1 paper with author 1. They published 1 paper each with authors 4 and author 5. So how this is represented on this particular map, these authors on the fringes here that only have 1 paper or aren't really influential, they'll actually show up on the fringes in this network here. The authors that are more central to this body of literature, so for example, author 1 here and author 2, they'll be more closely situated in this cluster here. So if we were to take a very simple comparison here, we can think of A1 and A2 being Alcott and Tandock, and then the authors on the fringes who don't publish that often but are still connected to this network, A4, A5, and A3. These would be people like Jin and Newman and Narvaez, and so on. So that's the theoretical underpinning of VosViewer, and all the maps that we're going to see for the rest of this workshop. It's not magic. It's just it's basically this model with hundreds of authors and papers and so on. And what's really cool about VosViewer is that it's not just author networks that you can get. So this is what I was showing you before. These are the kind of most commonly occurring keywords in all the papers in a certain body of literature. And we can get some really sophisticated analyses here. I'll show you one here. We can get different citations by journal as well. So if we look at a certain body of literature, what journals are publishing the most and what journals are citing each other. So for example, digital journalism for fake news is a pretty central journal, and it's citing a lot of papers from journalism studies, and journalism studies, vice versa, is citing a lot of papers from digital journalism. So we can do a lot of things in VosViewer related to citations, author analyses, and even institutions and what countries are publishing. So these are the kind of rich insights that you can get through VosViewers that I think journal editors find so compelling when you write a paper out of it. So with that said, let's actually go through the machinery of this, and I'll show you exactly how we can publish, or excuse me, generate maps like this through VosViewer. Just so we're not talking about it, we'll actually do some exercises here. So as I mentioned, the exercise that we'll do is we'll actually do this particular fake news paper that we're talking about. So just a little bit of background there. A few months ago, we had there's an invitation for papers that Kurt Planger in the UK told us about, and Leyland and I thought it'd be a cool idea to generate a paper based on VosViewer on fake news and what the current state of the literature is and what the academic discussions surrounding it are. We just got it published in a NATO paper, Defense Strategic Communications. It's an official journal for NATO. And what we're going to do today is go through step by step how we generated the VosViewer analyses and how we actually wrote this paper. So again, the point is, let's find all the papers that are out there related to fake news so we can get a lay of the land on what people are saying about fake news in the academic literature. So the first thing we're going to do is, as I mentioned before, for VosViewer to have any data to work with and generate these maps, it's not smart enough to go searching the web itself. You actually have to feed it raw data. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to do a search on Web of Science. So you should have access to this through your university. If you don't have Web of Science, you can do the same thing through Scopus. I find that Scopus has a lot of false positives in there. And by false positives, I mean, there's a lot of non-academic articles that get labeled as academic articles. So they tend to muddy the final results a little bit. You get a lot more data, but I think Web of Science is quite a bit cleaner and targeted. So what we're going to do in Web of Science to generate a list of all papers that are out there related to fake news, it kicked me out, so I'm just going to log in again. Okay, we're in. So we're just going to go straight to advanced search. And what we want to do is we want to look at any topic. We want to actually use this topic tag. So we just follow this here. We say topic TS equals. And what we can do is they have this thing called a Boolean search. So I want to look at anything related to fake news or deep fakes. And there's these kind of corollary terms that are related to fake news and deep fakes called truthiness and post-fact. So I just this is kind of where a little bit of your own knowledge about the particular domain comes into play. But I want to get a full list of all the papers that are related to fake news. Actually, I have this ready, so I'm just going to copy and paste it so you don't have to watch me type. Okay, so this kind of seems a bit, it seems a little bit kind of verbose, but it's actually pretty simple. All I'm doing is I'm putting in the topic tag, TS, and they give you a legend here. And I'm writing, I want any paper related to fake news or truthiness or fact or deepfakes. And I could keep going as well. If I wanted to get really granular here, I could say, Trump fakes, right? Or artificial intelligence deep fakes. But when you get more and more granular, there's kind of like an inflection point where there's a lot of diminishing returns. With these 4 terms, I'm pretty confident I'm going to get everything related to fake news. I could put in 100 terms in there, but I probably won't get that many additional papers doing that. So this is what we thought a good this is what we thought a good middle ground was, kind of 4 main keywords to get all these papers. I just want English papers, and I just want articles. So I don't really want things that are for editorials. So, if an editor writes a 1 or 2 page commentary, that's not really an academic article. So I just want the actual journal articles here. And then we just click search. So what Web of Science is going to return to me, it's returning 929 results of all the papers that are out there from any journal that is related to fake news, truthiness, post-fact, or deepfake. So what I'm going to do here is click on this 929. And right off the bat, what's really cool about Web of Science is that it gives you a lot of these analyses that were previously conducted manually just for free right off the bat. So if I actually, before I do anything with VosViewer, if I go to analyze results, you can kind of see that they've broken out the various topic categories here. So what this is telling us is there's, out of our 929 total papers, 244 of them are related to communications, 69 are related to computer science. So one thing I'll show you quickly here is that we have this publication years. And this is quite enlightening for us. So we had a hunch that this whole fake news phenomenon came about after the US election in 2016. You remember Trump started using that word pretty frequently, and then it dispersed and proliferated among common discourse. And just as we suspected, the number of papers written on fake news accelerated starting in 2017. So nobody really cared and knew much about it before. In 2016, Trump comes out and starts, that particular term becomes pretty common in the mainstream media. And then people start writing articles about it, and then they start being published in 2017. But what's cool about this Web of Science analysis is that what I was showing you before in that manually driven paper, if I go back here, all of those metrics, as I mentioned before, we compiled manually, right? And if I'd even known about this Web of Science feature before, it would have been tremendously helpful. So even for quick bibliometric reviews that don't need a lot of sophistication, Web of Science provides a lot of that just right off the hop. And it keeps going here. So for example, if I want to see all the major organizations or universities that are publishing papers related to fake news and deep fakes, I can just click on organizations, and we see that the University of London is the university that's producing the most papers on fake news. So if you don't know this already, I encourage you to take advantage of Web of Science's built-in tools. But what we're going to do here is I'm just going to go back to our raw search results. Again, just a reminder, when I put in these fake news terms, these four, to date, there have been 929 papers related to it published. And now what I want to do is I want to take all of this information that we're seeing on the screen, and I want to output it into a format that VosViewer can read, so VosViewer can generate these maps for us. So what I'm going to do there is I just click on export, and VosViewer likes it in other file formats, and I'll explain why in a second. So what do we want to export? We want to export everything, but Web of Science only lets you export 500 records at a time, but we have 929 records. So that's not a problem. We'll just do 2 exports, and then VosViewer will be able to read both. So when I want to select what I want to record or what I want to export, I just click on full record and cited references. So that's just saying, the only difference between author, title, and source is that the full record gives you things like bits of the abstract, and it gives you a full bibliography that we're going to actually need. So I just want everything. And I'm on a Mac right now, so I want tab delimited Mac. So VosViewer likes tab delimited format for the analyses we're going to do. So I'm just going to click on that. I'm going to export it. So what's happening now is Web of Science is giving me a raw data file here. And before I start opening them or working with them, we know that we've only got the first 500 of these. So let's export the rest of them. So we already exported 1 to 500. So if we want to get the rest, we want records 501 to 929, because 929 is the total number of papers that we have. So again, we want full record and cited references, and we want tab delimited Mac, and we export it. So it's sending the rest of the records to my downloads folder, and you can kind of see it shows up at the bottom right here. So these 2 files, we don't even need to open them. I'll open them just to show you what's in here, but it's a lot of gobbledygook. If you really read into this, you'll see that it's the authors, it's the abstract of what's in the papers, but all we care about is feeding this into VosViewer. So from here, I'm going to open VosViewer. And for those of you who haven't tried it yet, VosViewer is a free download. You just go to vosviewer.com, download, and there's an option for Windows and there's an option for Mac. So there's nothing too crazy there. It's not complicated. But what we want to do in VosViewer now is we want to take that raw data and we want to actually produce something meaningful like this that we can use in our papers. So what I want to do is I want to create a VosViewer map. And from here, I actually want to create a map based on bibliographic data. These other options, so creating a map based on network data and on text data, these are highly customized options. So if you have your own network data and you say that, Andrew Park is connected to Jan and Leyland, and you have your own raw data and you want VosViewer to add another layer of visualization on top of that, that's when you would want it. To be perfectly honest, we haven't used any of these other options before. This bibliographic data, which is the default one, is probably what you're going to want to use 99% of the time. So we just have bibliographic data. We go to the next screen. And then same here. So it says, what kind of data do you have right now? And we have Web of Science data since that's where we exported our data. So we'll just leave it on the default option they give us. It's pretty simple there. And then you have to upload the files that you want to use. So if you use Scopus to export your data, you just need to click on the tab. But Web of Science is the first one they give you, and you probably won't need to change it. And then when you actually want to upload, you just need to, and you have multiple files. You don't need to, remember we have one file that's records 1 to 500 and another that's 501 to 929. You just need to select the 2 files that you downloaded. I have a few extra here because I've downloaded it a few times, but these 2 are the saved records that I have. So then I click next. So I'll talk us through a little bit what the various options we're seeing here are. So this is really the kind of core of VosViewer and the options that you can select depending on the type of analysis that you want to do. So what I was mentioning in the fake newspaper, I'll just go back to that quickly here. One thing that, well, the first thing we probably want to generate is we want to find out how the authors are connected to each other, right? So we want to understand what authors are citing each other. We want to understand what authors are the most prolific, so which ones are publishing the most papers. And we want to find out what authors are the most influential in that, which authors are being cited the most in this body of literature. So I'm just going to click on co-authorship first, and I want to analyze authors. So I keep saying authors, but we can do the same thing with universities. So we can find out which universities are publishing the most, what universities are citing other ones, and so on. But we're going to stick with authors here. Excuse me. So this next option here is counting method. So the difference between full and fractional counting, I'm just going to go here. Back here. It comes back down to this mathematical model here. So when VosViewer is asking you if you want full counting, do you want to give all of these authors down here who only have one published paper with each other equal weight? Or do you want to give greater weight to authors who have more published papers? So so the difference there is we want to give a credit to a credit of 1 to each of these authors like we have here. Or since all of these authors, in theory, if they only publish one paper with each other and they're showing up on the map here, in theory, we should probably bring their credit down to 0.33 each, since this is all just one paper. But if you actually look at this particular map, you have no idea if author 5 published one paper that co-authored with A1 and A4, if author A4 co-authored with A5 and A1, if they're all different papers, or if this is all just one paper that they co-authored with each other and they're getting credit for it. So in short, what VosViewer is asking you is, do you trust us to make an assessment of how much credit to give authors based on whether there's a ton of authors on a single paper? So we'll say yes for fractional counting, and this will make a lot of sense when we actually look at the map. And then same here. So ignore documents with a large number of authors. So let's say there's one paper that has 100 authors on it. Do we want them all to show up on the map and get full credit for having written a paper? Or do we want to just cut that out because it's going to muddy our results too much, right? I don't think we usually want to ignore documents. It's pretty rare that, at least in the business domain, you see papers with 25 plus authors. So I'm going to uncheck that, but I am going to select fractional counting because I want VosViewer to make a judgment call on whether to discredit authors who just show up here because they have a paper with 100 other co-authors, right? And that'll show up on the network. So then I click next. And then this kind of becomes a judgment call as well. So if an author, so there's 1,985 authors in our raw data, right? If we actually want to include them all in our map, so include all authors who have at least one published paper, then naturally every single author is going to show up on our map. But having 2,000 authors on this map is pretty unwieldy. You can see here we probably only have about 20 authors, and the network's already a bit tough to see when you look at these smaller nodes. So usually, just a general rule of thumb of having written a lot of these papers, anything more than about 30 authors or so kind of muddies the results a bit. So let's just set a number where we say an author has had to have published at least 3 documents for them to make it to this list. Or if this kind of body of literature is small such that we don't want to ignore any authors, we can actually filter this by citations as well. So we'll say, okay, you'll make the list if you're an author, as long as you have 1 published document, but it needs to have at least, say, 30 sites, right? So if you've published 1 paper, but nobody cited it, it's not an influential paper, then we don't care if you're on this network. So what we say is you need to have at least 30 sites for you to make it on this. And that's important because now we're actually getting a flavor for what the most influential papers in fake news are. So then we click next. This next default screen, it's just saying, so out of that 1,985 authors, 74 are going to make it on your list. Are you sure? So we click next. And then already we get a lot of really cool information here. So VosViewer is telling us that these are the most prolific authors. So Gordon Pennycook has 7 documents related to fake news in our sample. And then Gordon Pennycook is tied with David Rand, and then so on. So there's one thing related to how prolific an author is, but if we want to see who the most influential authors are with regards to citations, we can click on the citation column. And interestingly, we see that Tandoc doesn't have as many documents published as Pennycook, but Edson Tandoc has way more citations than Pennycook, who's down here, probably about 80 more citations or so. So again, kind of going back to what we were doing manually, you can imagine the time saving. So all of this, we had to go through thousands of papers, tabulate them in a Google Doc, and then sort them that way, which obviously took weeks and weeks. But you can kind of see in a few minutes, we were able to do it in VosViewer here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually produce this network map. So it says here, some of the 74 authors in your network aren't connected to each other. The largest network consists of 5 items. Do you want to show this set of items instead of all items? And what that's asking you is, when we look at a published paper, it's basically asking you all these authors that are on the fringes. VosViewer is saying, hey, do you want us to just get rid of them so you can focus on the main network? Or do you want to see what the entire network map looks like, even if there aren't connected authors? So in this case, let's just see what the whole map looks like. So I'll click no, I want to see everything. And you can see here, these are the different clusters of authors who work with each other. So as we saw before, we see that Pennycook is publishing a lot of articles with someone named Cannon. And then Newman is publishing a lot with Gary and Tandoc and so on. So this in itself is quite interesting to a journal editor because they can see who are kind of the key contributors of my journal, not necessarily just who's publishing the most articles, but who's actually forming this cluster related to fake news, this emerging topic, this emerging domain. Who are the people that people are looking to want to write papers with, and who do I need to keep an eye on as this particular conversation evolves related to fake news in academia. I'm just going to quickly redo this, and I'm going to select that option where they asked if we want to get rid of all the fringe authors. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to put this back. So again, we're back to this page that says, do you want to show this set? So do we just want to see the main network, right? So this is the main cluster. So these are kind of our godfathers who are related, who are publishing papers related to fake news. So Bernstein, Lindsay, Newman, and so on. So a lot of papers are coming out related to fake news with these 5 authors working with each other. I'm going to show you a couple other examples of what VosViewer can generate related, but this time we're actually going to focus on citations. So if we take a look here, this is something called a citation analysis. So we were looking at co-authorship here. So if I said citations before, I actually meant co-authorship. So these authors are writing papers with each other, but we also want to find out, and VosViewer can provide what authors and papers are citing each other. So this is one, again, related to fake news that we published. This particular paper is quite an influential one, and we can see the size of the node. So this BAME one here in 2005, and this Alcott one, these are pretty influential papers, and Alcott is citing Guess, and Guess is citing Alcott. So if we want an idea of what papers are citing what, we can generate that through VosViewer, and we'll do that now. So all these initial options we can maintain. And then we're back to this core page here of the various analyses that we can produce using VosViewer. So I'm going to do the citation one that I talked about. So excuse me, we're going to see which authors are citing each other. We can do it by document as well. So before we were looking at papers that were citing each other, but we can look at what authors are citing each other. And we can actually, let's do organizations just because we haven't done that. So what universities are citing each other? So you can imagine each of these authors that you see on the screen, they all come from a university. So we want to know, are there particular schools that are particularly influential that are all citing each other in this domain of study? So again, we're not going to ignore documents that are co-authored by a large number of organizations. And then we just click next. And same as before, we can set some reasonable limits here, and you'll develop your own preferences here. There isn't a right or wrong answer, but I don't want to exclude any university just because they've only published one paper on fake news. But I do want to set some reasonable citation thresholds here. So again, if a university's published 100 papers, but nobody cited any of those papers, then it's not that meaningful. It's not that interesting to me. So I want to set, say, for example, you can even say 50, right? So each paper that gets included in this particular output that we're going to see has to have had at least 50 citations. And we see that there's 32 universities that have had at least one paper related to fake news that have had at least 50 citations. So then I click next. I click next again. And this is kind of our kind of high level analysis of what's going on in this field of study with organizations. So I'm just going to sort this by document. So we see that Boston University is the most prolific university. They have 13 papers related to fake news, and they have 116 citations. So this is what journal editors really like to see too. They say, okay, well, maybe Boston University is a real heavy hitter in my field of study here, or in my particular domain of study. But if we actually sort this by citations, we see that NYU sort of blows Boston University out of the water, right? So they have fewer documents. They only have 10 papers in the sample, but they have an aggregate 403 citations. So we see that Boston University is the most prolific, but Stanford and NYU, they are quite a bit. They pack a lot more punch when it comes to people citing those papers. So we'll finish here. by clicking yes. I want to, or sorry, let's just see all the universities, not just the ones that are in a single network. So here we see, so here you can play, you can see a giant cluster of universities here. Oh, Simon Fraser's here. So if you can kind of click around here and you can see this cluster is so concentrated. It's not, there's not that much you can do with it. And this is when you can start playing with the VosViewer things here. You can change the size of the labels if you want. You can zoom in using these arrow icons here, and you can get a little bit more information that way. If you want the raw data, this is where you actually look to see it. So if you go to the left side here, there's this file tab and the items tab. And these are all the, this is actually the actual raw data that you see here. So you can kind of see there's these different clusters that are the different colors. So in cluster 2, we have 7 items, you know, Boston University, Emerson College. All of these universities are citing each other, right? So we see UBC is in this 3rd cluster. UVic and Simon Fraser are citing each other in this cluster, this purple one down here. But all of these clusters are connected. So at least one university from each of these clusters is citing. This is basically opinion. And the best way to kind of get a better network map, if you want to output this to your paper, is to go back and redo your analysis, but select that option where it lets you, I'm just going to set this to 30 and 1 again. Select that option that lets you get rid of the papers that are outside of this main network. So do you want to show this set of items instead of all items? That was 50. So then it doesn't actually need to zoom out to show all the all the universities that are in the periphery. So now this is a much more interesting map to me because we can actually see what the network connections are here. So then the next question becomes, okay, so I've got this VosViewer output, and we're going to kind of transition in a few minutes here into writing the paper itself. But let's say I've got this giant network map here. What's the best way to output this? So you can kind of imagine that what you typically do is you probably take a screenshot like this, and then you kind of dump it into a Word document or something like that. But a lot of editors and even reviewers sometimes complain because there's so much granularity here that you really want high resolution. So they give you a nice screenshot option here. And it gives it to you in, it's not quite vectored format, which is like the best you can get, but it's pretty high resolution. So I can just save this as kind of whatever file name I want. So university citation, save. And then it'll save to my downloads folder. And then I get a nice rich file format here that I can dump into my paper when I write it. Before we move off this VosViewer window here, I just want to quickly explain some of these things, some of these other options here, because depending on what you're trying to do, these are actually quite useful and quite insightful as well, but they're a little bit confusing when you first look at it. And fortunately, VosViewer doesn't have good, they don't have really great explanations. So for example, if I want to know what bibliographic coupling is, and I actually read what this tooltip gives you, it says the relatedness of items is determined based on the number of references they share. That kind of sounds pretty abstract, and I can't really make much sense of that. So VosViewer actually has a manual that you can download off their website, which kind of funny enough, it has the opposite problem. It's kind of all these definitions are buried in a 47-page manual. So I just wanted to kind of verbally explain what each of these things are, in case you don't want to take the time to kind of dig through a giant, ponderous manual that VosViewer publishes on their website. So I think co-authorship is pretty self-evident. This tells us what authors are writing papers with other authors, what organizations or universities are writing fake newspapers with other organizations, and countries as well. So all the universities from Canada tend to write a lot of papers related to fake news with universities from Australia, right? This is the co-authorship button. Co-occurrence is really cool as well, especially if you want to see the progression of a conversation. So is fake news, are there a lot of papers related to Trump and politics? Is there a lot of a lot of papers being published on fake news related to artificial intelligence? VosViewer can actually extract how closely tied certain keywords are to each other. Actually, let's run that, because what's really cool about VosViewer is you don't even need to tell it the keywords in advance. It'll tell you what the most common keywords are, and then it'll produce a network map on its own. So let's just quickly run one of those. So minimum number of occurrences of a keyword. How many times does this particular keyword have to show up in all these papers in my sample for VosViewer to count it in its network map? So let's say 20. Yeah, 20 is good. Let's click next. And this is the screen. So I didn't even tell VosViewer what keywords to look for. It automatically calculated these keywords. It automatically identified these keywords and calculated the number of occurrences. So in all these papers, naturally fake news shows up the most because we actually search for those papers. But these other ones like social media and misinformation and media and disinformation, you remember these weren't actually part of our search terms when we went into Web of Science. VosViewer is smart enough to identify them and tell us what the keywords are. So when we actually finish this, it gives us this pretty interesting map as well to see how these keywords are related to each other. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, but we see fake news at the center as we expect, since that's what we searched for. But we see that VosViewer identified that a cluster of papers have been published related to Facebook, social media, Twitter, and the social net. So what this is saying is a lot of papers related to these topics are citing each other or are being written together with different authors, or authors who are writing on these topics are citing each other as well. And we see in this green cluster, there's another kind of body of literature related to communications and the internet and its impact, and things related to kind of say online reviews. That's happening in this kind of body of literature, and so on. So we've got this other one on the cluster here related to politics and science and post-truth. So we actually did this in our paper, in our NATO paper, and we found at the time we ran this, this is what I was showing you before. So so this isn't just kind of, as I was mentioning before, something abstract that is just kind of cool to know. There's actually tangible information that was very interesting to NATO, because they can understand what academics are interested in and what articles are being published related to fake news. So there's some anticipatory actions that they can conduct, or at the very least, they can follow which way the discussions are trending.
Andrew, may I ask a quick question?
For sure, yeah.
The images, I think they're really cool, the maps. VosViewer doesn't allow you to export a dynamic map where you can actually highlight or click on different things or zoom in and out and do exactly what you're doing here. But you could host it, as a supplement to an academic article.
Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, they don't yet. I think we actually got that from that request from a reviewer, because I think they downloaded VosViewer and they were like, something that's really cool is that you can highlight fake news and see what it's related to, or you can highlight social media. You can't actually do that unless you can save this as a VosViewer file, but the person on the other end would need to download VosViewer and then import it for them to do it. So there's probably something that will and can be done eventually when there's like, for example, like a web reference to a particular paper that tells you, hey, if you want something more interactive, download this VosViewer file, but you can't embed it in a paper currently, unfortunately. But I imagine that's probably a pretty popular request, though. Yeah.
Well, the tool is about 5 years old, I think, right? And I would imagine that if they found a way to just put these images, they can't be that data intensive, into the cloud and just provided you with a link.
Yeah, I completely agree. So what they really should do is they should have kind of a quick little web app where you get like a token or a username and password, and you go in there and you can highlight these things on their website instead of having to download VosViewer. So So I completely agree. That seems like something logical that the author should do, but I guess they're busy academics and haven't gotten around to it yet.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Um, so just, I do want to leave about 10-15 minutes for questions, but the last thing I wanted to actually show you was um, now that we've understand how to output all this data, it's great having this data, but what can we actually write? How do we produce a paper out of this, right? So it's one thing to have all this rich data kind of sitting in a folder somewhere, but you want to weave a coherent story that's compelling, and you want to actually submit something to a journal editor that's not necessarily just, hey, here's 20 charts. This is what's happening in your field of study. Please publish us, right? So, and that's one thing, that was a learning process for me as well. It's kind of when Leyland told me about this tool, I had a blast over few weeks just generating all these charts and stuff. But when I brought it back to Leyland, it was time for us to actually kind of write a story related to it. And obviously the biggest advantage you can have is if you're inherently interested in the topic, then obviously that is good motivation for you to write the paper. But even if you're trying to get a lay of the land of a particular journal, there's ways to write a compelling story for a journal editor. So we'll actually kind of look at the narrative of this fake news paper that we wrote and was published, just so you can get a sense of the different things that you can write about, right? So we'll skip the abstract here, but you see this introduction is pretty standard. So we kind of got a bit of a fortuitous turn here in that we had our final couple of revisions when COVID was coming about. So there was a lot of fake news related to COVID. So we thought it'd be timely to talk about it. So we can see that during the global COVID pandemic, politicians are spreading fake news, but not just politicians, but journalists and other trusted information sources as well. So just like any typical paper you would write, we have to kind of create a problem that we want to solve, right? Or not create a problem, but we need to identify a problem and at least convince the reader that this is worth talking about, right? So then we say, this is part of our introduction, but we say the rise of fake news has brought these practices to the forefront in academia and political discourse, the public social media and mass media debates. So now we're talking about this is how important fake news has become. And this is because it's so important, you should keep reading. And this is why our paper is interesting, right? So then we give a little bit of a history of what fake news is. Fake news isn't actually a new phenomenon. It actually is traced back to the English Civil War, kind of with fake propaganda and so forth. But then we talk about its evolution here in the next page. And we see that it hit a fever pitch around the time of the 2016 US presidential election. And now we're saying, okay, so fake news has become something really popular to talk about, but we really want to track where this conversation is headed, what kind of academics and what topics are academics writing about related to fake news, and what can we anticipate and what can we see moving forward. So how do we kind of, if NATO, for example, wants to guide this discussion, they in theory could kind of place their focus or their attention on certain areas of research and prioritize that over others. Or as I was mentioning before, they can just at least know where the body of literature is now and kind of track it moving forward. So that's why this is important, and this is why the reader should read the rest of the paper, right? And this is where we justify why this paper was necessary from a bibliographic perspective. We haven't seen any bibliographic reviews related to fake news. Anything related to truthiness or deepfakes or anything kind of remotely related to this. We haven't seen anyone do a lay of the land paper on fake news, which is why you should read our paper. And then we talk about what the reader can expect, right? So we tell them that we're using the VosViewer software to actually produce this paper. I'll make this bigger. And then we say, so what you're ultimately going to get out of our paper is that you'll see that fake news is deconstructed into two dimensions, the intention to deceive and the intention to harm. And then we also notice that through our VosViewer analysis that fake news can be split into these 4 subdomains like disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, and non-information. So that's kind of our introduction there. And then this is when we actually go into, I'm just going to skip to the data part, because this is more kind of a deep dive into what fake news is, how it evolved, and the differences between some of these other similar, some of these other related but technically disparate terms. These four ones that we're focusing on. So searching the literature. So what's really interesting and what's cool is that if you're writing 6 or 7 of these papers, we don't want to be formulaic. We obviously don't want to be rewriting the exact same thing over and over again. But because our methodology was the same, like we went through Web of Science, we identified a certain number of documents. A lot of the methodology parts of these papers are look very similar, and they're very easy to write once you've done it once, right? So again, it's not formulaic, but it is literally what we did each time, right? And then we talk about, as we showed in the manually driven study, we talk about what the most influential papers are, which ones got the most cites, all of that. We talk about the same thing here, but we had the advantage of generating it automatically through VosViewer instead of having to do it through manual means. So this is all just taken right from VosViewer. This last paper that we did, this is all done manually. So weeks of work versus minutes of work here. And then we talk about our bibliographic analysis. So I'll just show a couple quick examples here. So this is when we start showing these sophisticated network maps that VosViewer presents here. So what we'll do here is in the paper, we define those terms that we're going to present to the reader. So we tell them what a co-authorship analysis is, tell them what co-occurrence is, we tell them what a citation analysis is, and a co-citation analysis. So we're defining all of those kind of, we're defining those obscure terms that aren't really laid out very well right in the VosViewer tool. So when the reader comes across a network map like this, they know exactly what co-occurrence of keywords means, and they know what they're looking at. So we do that upfront for the reader. And then this is when we actually start presenting the results. So this is the evolution of evolution of publishing activity related to fake news. So we see a huge uptick starting in 2016. And then exactly like I talked about in this tutorial, this is when we actually talk about these particular network maps. So we see this co-authorship analysis. We present the network map that we got directly from VosViewer. And then we just talk about it here. So there are 2 distinct networks of authors who write on this topic, the most prominent of which is a network between Bernstein, Gary, and Lindsay. And you can see here it's Gary, or Bernstein. We must have mentioned Fenn up here as well. But basically, we're just talking about what the reader is seeing here. And again, not to be formulaic, but this is all interesting information for the editor. But we can talk about the same thing in each paper in the results section, because that's literally what the results show, right? So we first have our co-authorship analysis, then the co-occurrence analysis. So I'll just quickly, before we do that, show you, we did the same co-authorship analysis, but we did it by country. So we see that scholars from the US write a lot of papers with scholars from Canada and scholars from Germany. But for example, scholars from Norway don't really write too many papers with scholars from South Korea. So after we do that, we talk about co-occurrence, which were the keywords, and same thing. And again, the results parts of the papers look very similar across all the papers, not because of anything kind of intentional, but when you're using VosViewer and doing these bibliometric analyses, it's really convenient in that a lot of these network maps look similar. So you can write a lot of papers. You can be very productive using VosViewer. So this is the citation analysis that I was mentioning before. And it gets pretty sophisticated as well, because you can kind of go more deeply into, I'm just going to skip to a section called, oh, maybe we didn't do one here actually, but there's one option in VosViewer called bibliographic analyses, bibliographic coupling. And what bibliographic coupling is, it's when 2 publications cite a third publication. So for example, let's say Leyland and I wrote a paper that about fake news, and we just by chance we both cite a paper written about Trump that has nothing to do with fake news. That's actually interesting from a network perspective because, from a scholarly standpoint, what's that connection? Why are Andrew and Leyland both writing separate papers, but they're citing this third paper related to Trump, but the Trump paper isn't related to the paper topic that Leyland and Andrew are writing about. So this is the kind of level of detail and nuance that, unfortunately, as you all know, there's a lot of reviewers. They demand a level of depth and analysis for the sake of demanding a level of depth and analysis, right? So this is where VosViewer has really sophisticated network maps that you can talk about that satisfy that requirement upfront for a reviewer. So it gets really deep as far as how much you can write about it. But there is this bibliographic coupling option that I don't think we used in this particular paper, but you can if you wish. And then just to round off this particular paper, so then we have a general discussion after we show them all these maps and what they mean. So then we remind the reader that the purpose of the paper was to give you a lay of the land and the current state of research on fake news and truthiness and post-fact and deep fake. And we have a bit of a summary here saying the US is disproportionately represented in this select group. And then we talk about our most influential authors here. And then this is where a lot of your creativity comes into play as well. So depending on the topic you're talking about, you can talk about, and for us here, it was a lot of fun writing this section actually. So outside of this whole, the specific discussion on fake news, we noticed that when you look at the keywords, a lot of the papers are split into misinformation, malinformation, non-information, and disinformation. So from a strategic communication standpoint, when you're trying to find out what researchers are studying, when we can have this typology and we can bucket these four different topics and look at them individually, it gives us a level of insight into the discourse related to fake news that might not immediately have been evident just by looking at the papers as a whole, right? So this is where the insights related to VosViewer, I think, can really make an impact to the reviewer or the journal editor. And this is where you can kind of add this is your calling card as far as, what the implications of this information are. So one last thing that I want to talk about. So the kind of last thing here, we talk about, where do we go from here? Where does the fake news literature, how is it going to evolve, right? So we say if the trends identified in this literature review persist, fake news research will continue to be important in a variety of academic disciplines. So not just in politics, but all these other different problem domains that we identified. So communications and even in business and management, right? So strategic communication scholars, we purposely use that word because the title of the journal is Defense Strategic Communications. Practitioners and policymakers can benefit from this bibliographic review as it speaks to the direction of the conversation. And then authors, like I was mentioning before, it's not just for scholars and policymakers, but prospective authors and journal editors can also benefit by thinking about what do we want to write in the future, right? So if we want to purely just get something published and the discussion related to post-truth and science and politics is getting pretty saturated, maybe I want to start thinking about writing something a little bit closer to social media and Twitter and the social net, just to kind of carve out my role in this domain of discussion. So you can kind of see the flow of the paper is pretty standard as far as typical paper that you would write. But the kind of general conclusion here is I think VosViewer enables a lot of really sophisticated insights that you can generate rapidly. And Leyland and I, and Jan's been involved as well, but we've published a lot of papers using VosViewer, not necessarily for the sake of publishing papers, but it enabled us to answer a lot of questions that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to through manual means. So So I'll take a pause there. Hopefully that was useful to you. My kind of goal was to kind of show you start to finish of how you can think of a topic, use VosViewer to generate the data for it, and then write a paper out of it, and hopefully get it published. So maybe I can take a stop there and then take any questions that people might have had while I was going through this.
So let me jump in real quick. Thank you, first of all, Andrew. Thanks for taking the time to prepare all of this and sharing all of your experience with VosViewer and taking us along on this journey. I think you've done a great job in introducing us to the tool, but also then in showing us how you actually use it and what to do with it. I've got a few points, but this is less about what my points are. It's more about what some other people have in terms of questions and comments.
Okay.
I noticed I've been keeping an eye on the chat, and I sent two messages out, one to Rebecca and one to Leyland, both who act either as editors-in-chiefs or associate editors for journals. And the question that I had that I hope they can comment on a little bit is, given the descriptive nature, and Rebecca commented on this in the chat, which brought me to this question, given the descriptive nature of much of this, how can a researcher add value in a paper that is on a bibliometric review so that it becomes interesting and appealing to an editor?
So I'll speak first. I think when we first started getting these papers, the descriptive stuff actually was interesting, but because we're now getting quite a few of them, it means that the papers now need to go beyond the descriptive stuff. I guess what we're looking for is how some of the gaps in the theory, some of the problem areas that are being addressed. So how do we move the field forward based on this information? So while it's nice to know who's doing what, we need to have something that people are going to cite. I think that's the thing that drives editors, is citations. So we want people either to follow the method. So if they were to follow to do the same sort of analysis, we want them to either cite the paper from a methodological point of view, or we want them to cite it because it's a way of spurring field. So identifying conflicts in the literature is always great. So areas that need to be resolved, where there are apparent paradoxes, areas that are important managerially, but we lack the answers in academia, or areas where we, are going down the wrong pathway. So it's really about either raising challenges or synthesizing to push the field forward. It's really about identifying opportunities for other people to leverage off it. So it's nice to know what's happened in the past, but we need a little bit of a roadmap. I'm a bit of a fan of visual, so I don't particularly like articles that just say there's 3 things that we found, theme 1, 2, and 3. Right? It's like, well, how do they connect to each other? Is there a hierarchy here? So, if you can put things into some sort of visual to say, here's how the field's connected, or here are the gaps, here are the conflicts, here are the tensions, and you can visualize that in some way, it's easy for people to get a sense of what has been found in the paper and then bounce off it. So the visual thing is just my personal preference, but as a reader, I do find that more interesting.
Thank you, Rebecca. Leyland, do you have a thought or two to add? Microphone, please.
And I'll have to duck off in a moment, Jan, as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Very good points. Thanks, Rebecca. I would echo that. Understand there's 3 different kinds of papers that you can write using this approach. Whether you use VosViewer, as Andrew has discussed, or whether you simply do the old manual counting as Andrew did with the first paper that he published. The 3 different kinds of papers are, firstly, you can focus on a journal. So Andrew, in his paper, focused on the journal R&D management. My advice always is, before you do all that work and write the paper, approach the editor and ask the editor whether they might be interested in a paper on that topic. Some editors would say, somebody did it 4 years ago, and I don't think we can learn much more since then. Well, then you've saved yourself a bunch of work. Other editors would say, nobody's ever done this. I would love to see what you can tell us, and if I think it's worth it, I'll send it out for review. The second type of paper is you can look at a field. So Andrew, I'm not on it, but Andrew and some of his colleagues have a paper under review at the Journal of Engineering and Technology Management at the moment that looks at the top 10 journals in the field of technology management. So using different search terms on VosViewer, what's been happening in this literature and how has this literature evolved? And then the third type of paper that you can write is what I would call a breadth paper, something like the fake news paper that Andrew's talked about here, where you pick a topic that is hot, like fake news, and do a study across many disciplines, many different journals. I mean, that's what the tool is useful for. So the one thing is, if you're going to do it on a specific journal, don't just write it, do the work, and send it in, because the editor might say, I don't need this, I don't want it, and then you've spent a lot of time doing stuff that you didn't need to do.
Well, in Leyland, you won't be able to send it elsewhere, right? If you do it on a special journal.
Exactly. I mean, if you did this on the Journal of Consumer Research and they rejected it, nobody else is going to take it. What are you going to do with it?
Yeah, sure.
I have Mac patiently waiting, but before we get to Mac, any other thoughts on how authors might be able to add value to make these kinds of papers more appealing even to journals?
I'll just have a very quick commentary here. To Rebecca's point, I actually used VosViewer for the dissertation that I'm working on. And one way I did that is there's kind of a body of literature related to open innovation. And there's a couple kind of seminal pieces that lament the fact that all the open innovation literature is related to the case studies they use. It's always kind of large American software companies. And one of those seminal pieces said that, we suspect that the top, something like over 70% of papers that are on open innovations have been related to large American software companies, and this needs to change. So I actually used VosViewer to confirm whether or not that was the case. And it turns out that the influential papers in open innovation are on large software companies, but only about 8% of the total number of papers are on large American software companies. So that is actually one of the contributions of one of the papers I'm writing for my dissertation. And whenever somebody talks about, you see a paper that you like related to the state of the body of literature, you can actually use VosViewer to confirm whether or not they know what they're talking about, and write about it if it's true, if it's not true, and you can write about it even if it is true, right? It's like, we went and confirmed this, right? So from a theoretical standpoint, I think VosViewer has its place as well. So that's just the point that I would make.
No, it's a great point. And I think, many literature reviews are not necessarily evidence-based in the selection process. It's kind of what you find, and then you write what you write and call it good. But here you have some evidence. You can also provide some evidence on a gap and show how few people talk about a particular topic, which makes it even, if it's relevant in the real world, you can show that the literature isn't really caught up to that. So I think that's really cool for a PhD student, or anybody for that matter.
Yeah.
Mac, let me get to you. What was your comment or question, please?
Well, thank you very much for the great session. I guess he put so much details, and very good, guys. I have two questions because it's very new to me. So I don't know, do you have any suggestions for combine VosViewer together with, for example, SPSS or other traditional analysis software? And the second point, I guess you just mentioned, is how could we use VosViewer in literature review in the most effective way? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'll answer the first one. So what I was mentioning before about kind of confirming that gap in the literature, I actually quickly ran through SPSS. I looked at the total number of papers that in one domain talking about large American software companies and what they said, yes or no, do they advocate for open innovation? And then I looked at another population of papers that didn't talk about large American software companies, and yes or no, did they talk about, did they advocate for open innovation? And I ran a simple t-test on those just to kind of confirm my suspicion that I had that the initial author was incorrect. Beyond that, I haven't done much just because I'm fairly new to VosViewer myself, but I would imagine that there's a lot of different possibilities for using VosViewer as not only an output, but for an input for subsequent analyses using SPSS or even your own custom coded programs too. So, so that's just one example I have. It's the only one that I've tried, but I suspect there's quite a bit more. And then as far as the second question you had seemed a little bit broad of a question. Could you say that again, the second question?
Well, I just happen to think VosViewer are going to be very promising to be used for the literature review. So just also like to ask for your suggestion or how to use it the most effective way in your experience.
Yeah, so hopefully I'm answering this question directly, but I think there's kind of three major ways you can go with this, as Leyland mentioned. The first is the most obvious one is ask a journal editor if they'd be interested in a state of the kind of lay of the land of their journal, right? Yeah. And if they say yes, then write it with VosViewer and you're good to go, right? The second thing you can do is you can do what I did with this NATO one here is you can kind of ignore what journals and stuff that are out there, but you can kind of take a look at fake news and see what journals, what authors are publishing on it, right? And then the third avenue you can take is the one that Leyland described is take a look at the top 20 journals related to engineering and then see what they're talking about and where the discussion's gone. So I would say the answer to your question sort of depends on which of those three options you choose. But I'd be happy to send you this paper and a few other examples of how they made the literature reviews interesting and got them published.
Okay.
I think Mac was partially talking about PhD dissertations, in which case you're probably looking at number 2 in that list.
Yes.
Jan, can I come in here very quickly? Jan?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, sure. Those are good questions. I mean, the first one is I'm not much of a statistician, but all I can tell you is if you ever did courses, and I did them many years ago in multidimensional scaling and looking at distance mapping, the early work on for example, on product, on perceptions of brands and perceptual mapping, the further something is away from something else, obviously, the less related they are to each other. There's lots of statistical techniques that look at that nowadays. You can look at multidimensional scaling on SPSS. You can look at correspondence analysis on SPSS. VosViewer essentially does distance-based mapping. So where two authors are far apart from each other on a map, it means they don't really work with each other or they don't cite each other. So there is some, we haven't investigated a lot, but there's a lot of statistical analysis that you could use or do based on VosViewer generated data. The second one is something that I learned from Andrew. When you do a literature review for a paper or for a dissertation, and you want to make sure you haven't missed anything, I seriously didn't realize just how powerful Web of Science was. Andrew made it look easy, writing little Boolean code to search Web of Science for stuff. But those searches on Web of Science are incredibly powerful. And you might want to say, for example, you're writing a dissertation in marketing, and you want to say, I don't want to miss anything that has been published on this topic in any of the major marketing journals. Well, then you can search on Web of Science, just specifying the 20 top journals in the field, as opposed to, I don't want to miss anything, in which case you're going to end up with maybe 100 different journals. So something that I certainly learned by watching Andrew use is he would say it's hardly coding, but I don't know how to do that kind of stuff, and being able to search properly on Web of Science. If you don't know how to do it, get those skills. Your literature reviews and searches are going to be a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. So I know it's 4:30 and we're at the end of the time schedule. Andrew said that he's got a bit more time, so if there's more questions, please keep them coming. For those who have to leave, and I know a lot of people had to skip out and they sent quick messages to me. Before we lose everybody else, Andrew, thank you so much. This has been fabulous. It resonated with me on a number of things. You had me at minutes versus weeks. And I thought, if there's a way for me to save time, that's fantastic. My follow-up comment was related to what Leland was just saying. Use your time wisely and figure out all of your effort needs to go into Web of Science. Right? Find a good way to create that indexing file, because it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. VosViewer can only do what you feed it or analyze what you feed it. So get that one right, and then it'll help you with your identification of literature, but also of a gap, which is great. I like the typology you had at the end. I think that really adds value when you can make sense of the literature, not just describe it, but organize it and then sort of provide a lay of the land. And I don't know, Andrew, if you have a particular paper for Mac and others who are interested in writing a similar paper that you would share and say, this is a prototypical paper that I am most proud of, or that did set up the recipe for me, and you maybe you can tell us which one that is.
Yeah, for sure. So that's just the last thing I was going to say. Jan, I'll send you kind of like a PDF packet of a sample of the 3 types of papers that Leland described. And then I have like a 2-page little tips and tricks document for using both Web of Science and VosViewer. So there is kind of an artifact at the end of this session for people to take away. So the answer to your question is yes, and I'll send that over as soon as we're done.
Outstanding. Outstanding.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think you should also write a methods paper on writing bibliography or bibliographic papers.
Yeah, we've gotten pretty good at that.
I can tell. Any other questions or comments from anybody else?
I would just like to say thank you very much for this very useful session. Thank you, Andrew, and all of our other people's comments.
Thanks, Mac.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much also from me. I arrived late, but I will watch the video, and I certainly look forward to trying this for my literature reviews.
Yeah, great.
Yes, I'm like Jan, I'm really dying to find ways to speed up the search and make sense, different, particularly for topics where it could be subject to multidisciplinary research, where you can have people from different fields writing on the same topic. That would be really cool to see where the different clusters are and so on.
Right. You know the material in your domain, but not everything that people do in the office next door, right? So that's
exactly, yeah.
By the way, hello, Basma. This is
hello.
Mac, a new PhD student. Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you too, yes. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Perfect.
Well, perfect. We've spanned the globe. We've got people from all over the place. So thank you very much. Thanks, Andrew, for agreeing to give us this talk. And thanks everybody else for comments and questions and joining us. Look forward to seeing lots of papers come out of this. And I hope to see everybody in person again sometime very soon. With that, we'll officially conclude the session. Thank you very much, guys. Any more questions before anybody leaves? Nope, I think we're good to go. Thanks a million, Andrew.
Yep, thanks, Jan. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.